This is a lecture on Tolstoy on art. Leo Tolstoy is the author of two of the greatest Russian language novels and maybe two of the greatest novels ever written, Anna Karenina and War and Peace. It's usually not that interesting to look at pictures of the philosophers we consider, but man, this guy's photogenic. According to Tolstoy, there are two predominant views on beauty, or aesthetic properties. Both of them, in Tolstoy's view, are based on pleasure. If beauty, on the one hand, is in the mind of a subject, then it has to be because it gives the subject a certain kind of pleasure. Remember Kant's view, and Hume's view too. On the other hand, if beauty is a property that's in beautiful objects, well, we could only find out about the beauty in the objects if we get a certain kind of pleasure from them. Either way, aesthetic views are dependent on pleasure. Now, Tolstoy thinks that a view of art that relies on pleasure, he calls these aesthetic theories, has to be mistaken. Before we get to his criticisms of aesthetic views, here's a word from Tolstoy on our method of figuring out what art is. He thinks a method that takes objects that give a select group pleasure and then builds a theory on that basis is a bad method. Think about our method. We're thinking about some obvious artworks, and then we're trying to come up with an understanding of the concept of art based on that. He doesn't like that method. He likes definition first, and then figure out what the artworks are. Well, why? Why does he like that way? Why doesn't he like what we do? Figure out what the artworks are, think about the obvious artworks, and then generate a definition? Well, here's why. This slide's a mess, but I want to show it to you so you have it all in one place. Instead of talking you through it, I'm going to let Tolstoy talk you through the arguments. Number one, it's really difficult to get a once and for all definition this way, using our method. Whenever something new is created that tickles the fancy of the art elite, we're going to have to come up with a new theory. So if you've got a collection of works that the art elite has deemed to be artworks, but then those things stop giving pleasure and something else gives pleasure, then it's going to be hard in the end to maintain what we once thought of as the artworks. Number two, our way is not a scientific method. The scientific way would be to clearly define terms, in this case art, and then check objects to see if they qualify. The scientific way is to be clear on your definitions first. Number three, the art elite make mistakes. In every era, the art elite, or the people who determine what art is, have embraced ugly, meaningless, uninfluential things that's immediately forgettable. We can't trust them to determine what art is. Number four, look at the stuff that's currently accepted as art. There's no limit to the ugliness that'll be endorsed if the art elite consider themselves to be infallible. If we allow the art elite to determine what art is, then we're going to end up with their declaring utter trash to be art. I know this is ridiculous. I'm not sure why I got so carried away with it. Did we get it right, Leo? Okay, so we can move on? Bye. Notice Tolstoy thinks a method based on the pleasure of an elite group is a bad one. But all of his criticisms we could modify to cover any method that relies on a group of art determiners, whether it's pleasure-based or not. It didn't really have to be about pleasure. All of those criticisms that we just heard from Tolstoy are criticisms of our method. Let some group of people establish what the artworks are and then try to determine a definition. I still think it's a good one. See if you can respond to Tolstoy's arguments that our method is a bad one. What he wants to do is establish a definition first. Then we can look at things and tell whether they're art or not. Anyway, let's return to his criticisms of what he calls aesthetic views of art, pleasure-based views of art. Number one, if art involves beauty of some kind, that is, if the artist has to create beauty, then art's reduced to pleasure, and so is reduced to taste. But there can't be any kind of science of taste. There can't be any kind of systematic way of evaluating taste. But there has to be a science of art. There must be a systematic way of evaluating art, determining what it is, determining which pieces are better, and so on. So art can't be some kind of beauty. Argument number two against the aesthetic view. There's a similarity between art and food. They ultimately bring pleasure to a lot of people, and discussions of each one end up as discussions of taste. I like peas. I don't like peas. Now, just as the aim of food is not pleasure, but nourishment, survival, the aim of art is not pleasure, by analogy. Furthermore, just as a concept of pleasure doesn't help us understand food, it doesn't help us understand art either. Now, here's a closely related point that Tolstoy makes. According to a definition of art like Kant's, remember, Kant thinks that art is something that gives pleasure prior to contemplation. On a view like Kant's, food counts as art. If you taste food and it gives you pleasure prior to the contemplation of what food gets you, before you understand what it really gets you, say you have a Reese's peanut butter cup and it tastes so good, that would be art because it gives you that sort of pleasure, pre-contemplative pleasure. But that's clearly a mistake, says Tolstoy. Third objection to an aesthetic view. The question, does art give pleasure, seems like an open question. It's a reasonable question to ask for somebody who understands the terms. For somebody who's familiar with talking about pleasure and talking about art, that seems like a reasonable question to ask. But notice, if art just means the stuff that gives a certain kind of pleasure, then the question would be a confused question, not a reasonable or open question. Here's another way of understanding the same objection. The question, does art give pleasure, seems to have an empirical answer rather than an analytic one. That is, if you want to find out if art gives pleasure, you have to go out and look. It's not true by virtue of the meaning of the word art that it gives pleasure. So much for an aesthetic view. By the way, I made this one up, or at least Tolstoy didn't make it up. I got it from G.E. Moore's open question argument about morality. For an analogy, think about this. What if I defined water as the stuff that quenches thirst? There are all sorts of problems with that definition, but here's one. You might say, well, it's an open question or an empirical question whether water quenches thirst. If I asked you, does water quench thirst, would it seem like I misunderstood what water was? Did I somehow not understand the meanings of the terms I was using? Like if I asked, is a bachelor married? You would say, oh, he doesn't know what bachelor means. When I say, does water quench thirst? Do you say, oh, he doesn't know what water means? Or would you think, oh, he doesn't really know about the features of water? It's the second answer for the definition of water, right? Now, what about, does art give pleasure? Doesn't that seem like an open question? You don't have to misunderstand the word art to ask that question. You maybe misunderstand what art does, but you don't misunderstand what art means if you ask, does art give pleasure? Anyhow, I supplemented Tolstoy with that one. That's not really in there. Okay, here's Tolstoy's definition of art. It's not completely clear to me whether he's just declaring this definition, stipulating it, or if he thinks he's discovered it. Anyway, we'll come back to that. For Tolstoy, art is the intentional communication of feeling. Art happens when a creator or a performer remembers a feeling she previously had and intentionally tries to communicate that feeling by some external means and succeeds in making the audience experience it. So, if I'm an artist, I have to have felt a feeling and set about to communicate that feeling and succeeded in communicating it, succeeded in making you or some audience feel that feeling. This kind of communication of feeling is definitely possible. A person's happiness can make other people happy. Somebody's sorrow can bring other people down, and so on. Those aren't all instances of art unless I intend by some external means to make you happy in the way that I was happy. If I did that, if I tried to produce something that would make you happy in the same way that I was happy, then on Tolstoy's definition, if I succeeded in that, then I would be an artist. Here's Tolstoy's example, the boy's wolf tale. He says, suppose there's a boy who encounters a wolf and is afraid. If he tells a story designed to make other people feel frightened the way he was, then his story is artistic. Now, even if the boy didn't encounter a wolf, but he felt afraid, and he wanted to tell a tale to make you feel the fear he felt, and he made up a tale about a wolf, then that story would be artistic. It would be art. Remember about Plato that he thought art stirred the emotions of the audience too. He thought it was a terrible thing, but on the contrary, Tolstoy takes it to be a necessary thing and a condition of human life. Without access to the feelings of others, we would not be empathetic, we would be divided, we would not be able to live together. We would be savages, he thinks. This is where he brings up the example of Caspar Hauser. This guy grew up alone in a closet. When he was released as a teenager, he could only say a few phrases. He was unable to assimilate into society. Tolstoy thinks that art is the natural extension of this ability of human beings to communicate their feelings. Now notice his definition rules out pieces to which the audience feels nothing. If you're trying to communicate something but you're unable to communicate it, it's not bad art, it's just not art. Also, Tolstoy realizes that his definition includes things like a stirring sermon. If a sermon is uplifting and was intended to be so by a preacher who'd felt the same kind of uplift, then that's art. Moving speeches are the same, clothing could serve the same function, jokes, lullabies, maybe some advertisements could stir you to feel in a way about a product the same way that the people who produced the advertisement feel about the product. Well, what does he say about this overly broad definition? Well, for some reason, he says we've narrowed the use of art to certain artifacts that intentionally convey feelings. And it's sort of strange to think of these other things as artworks too, but they are. Certainly, Tolstoy doesn't back away. It's just one of the consequences of his definition. Now, by the way, you might have noticed now that he poo-pooed the aesthetic views, the views that were defined by their causing pleasure, but his view requires that artworks produce feelings in people. Now, it's not that easy to be an artwork, according to Tolstoy. It's not just pleasure that has to be aroused, and it's not just the arousal of pleasure. The thing has to be produced in order to bring about the feeling that the artist felt. There are more feelings than pleasure, and there are more requirements than just producing pleasure. So it's not really just a version of the view he was criticizing. He's gone beyond aesthetic views. Any objections come to mind? Well, here are a few. Sermons are art? Isn't that just a reductio ad absurdum of his view? Shouldn't we just take his method to have failed, his stipulating a definition and then letting the chips fall where they may? Doesn't that just fail if sermons count as art? Maybe not. By the way, not all sermons count as art. In fact, the vast majority don't. Just a handful of sermons might count as art on Tolstoy's view. Okay, what about this? He admits that most people don't use the word art in the way he's defining it. So why shouldn't we just think that he's talking about something else and he's trying to take our word art from us? He can't say, I have the correct definition because look at these common usages of the term. He's declared that sort of method to be a bad method for coming up with a definition. I don't think he can say that he's discovered the definition of art. It really seems like he's just stipulated it and tried to talk about that thing. But you might be rightly skeptical that his use of the term art overlaps at all or in any important way with what we're trying to discuss. Here's an epistemological problem. It doesn't mean he's wrong. It doesn't mean his definition of art is wrong. It just means it would be very difficult for us to use it. How could we know that we're feeling the very feeling that the artist intended for us to feel? Could we possibly be sure what the feeling is that the author intended? Does Prokofiev's Peter and the Wolf fill me with the same dread Prokofiev felt when he saw a wolf or when he didn't see a wolf? How could I possibly know that it's the same feeling of dread? Isn't it conceivable that an artist feels sorrow and produce a piece that's intended to make us feel sympathy rather than sorrow? Do we have to actually feel the sorrow in order for it to be an artwork? Can't we just recognize the sorrow in it? According to Tolstoy, those are only pseudo artworks. They're seeming artworks, but not really artworks. Okay, what about the infection of the audience part? Who is it that has to feel the emotion? Just one person in the audience? Doesn't that run into the very problem of art elitism that Tolstoy raised earlier? Is it just a handful of people? Is it most people? Is it everybody? Does that ever happen, that everyone who hears or sees an artwork feels the same thing, the very thing the composer intended?